You know, we as Americans like to think that football is America's game. And it's true, it is. We have our own brand of football, but it's come from so many roots of around the world that have developed their game of football and branded it as their own. And we're going to talk about that and some more with some experts that I've dug up from the archives of the Pigskin Dispatch podcast. And you're going to love this one with the early history of football coming up in just a moment.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of PigskinDispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pig Pen, your portal to positive football history. And we are really going to go back into the realm of football history. We're going to go back to the roots and even before there was American football. And I have had the pleasure and the blessings to talk to some of the foremost experts in the field of football that are still with us today that have some great insights on where the game came from. And I thought maybe this would be a good time to talk about the first years of football and how it developed in this part one of this series here. So let's first talk about, where football came from. The football genres, let's say, everybody knows about American football, but over in Europe, they call football quite something different, which is more well known as association football, where we get the word soccer from here in the States. Rugby football is around the world and played in different genres and styles and dialects around the world, especially in Europe. We play it here in the States. Australia plays it, but it's played worldwide. Australian rules football has come out of that, and some different European Union soccer or rugby and some of the other dialects of rugby as well. And Gaelic football is another one of them. Canadian football, and of course, our own American football. But what was rugby? It sort of seems like that was the offshoot. Well, a couple of years ago, we got to talk to the foremost expert of football, the genres, especially rugby, Dr. Tony Collins.
It can't, like all the different games that became modern football games. Its roots are really in this kind of pre-industrial society before people lived in towns and worked in factories and lived on the land, and lots of football style games were played where the ball was kicked, passed, thrown in order to reach a goal, which is kind of the basis of all the football games that we know today. And rugby itself emerged, as the name implies, from an elite private school in the English Midlands, Rugby School in the town of Rugby. And it's rugby schools in the 1820s, 30s and 40s. Rugby School became the kind of the flagship of the British elite private school system. And one of the things that made it that was the importance that it placed on sport, both football in the winter and cricket which is another sport which we won't get time to get into, which we won't get into now. Cricket was the summer game, rugby football was the winter game. And one of the interesting things that happened, which really I think gave rugby a massive advantage over the other football games that were played at other elite schools. So all the English elite schools had their own version of football. Some of your listeners may have heard of places, very elite institutions like Eton and Harrow. They also had their own versions of football. But rugby's became popular beyond its school because of the popularity of a book called Tom Brown's School Days, which you may have heard of. Came out in 1857, was a massive, massive bestseller, a kind of the equivalent of Harry Potter, but without the magic. And at the core of Tom Brown's School Days was a football match played under rugby rules. And the popularity of the book meant that people, not just in Britain, but people in the English-speaking world decided that rugby football was an important part of a young man's education. So the game had a kind of moral importance, not just it wasn't just a recreation or an entertainment. So it had this moral educative importance. And that meant that other schools took it up, and also that, people in the general public read the book and wanted to play the game. And that's also the case in the States as well. I mean, Tom Brown's School Days sold something like 250,000 copies in the States, and perhaps most famously, Teddy Roosevelt said that this is one of two books that every red-blooded American boy should read. So
now, as football transformed here in America, we put our own flavor into it. Of course, we got influenced when Harvard University hosted a Canadian university, McGill College, in 1874. Here's an excerpt from historian and author R.C. Christiansen.
Well, as lots of people know, McGill traveled to play Harvard in 1874. And then at that point, McGill introduced this. They had modified rugby by then to some extent, and they introduced that game to Harvard. And the fans actually liked it better there at Harvard, the other students that were watching the game. And so Harvard adopted McGill's rules. And so here we have the origin of the game then jumping from England to Canada and then down to the United States. And then it developed in the United States because Harvard started playing other teams using these rules, Yale being the first team that they played then in 1875. And then it grew through the Ivy League colleges from there.
They played 2 games one weekend in May of 1874, the first being the brand of football that McGill played, and the next day was the game that Harvard played, the Harvard game. Well, Harvard loved the McGill game so much that it became the offshoot of what we transpired into American football. So we can thank the Canadians for that. And let's look a little bit more about what football was from historian Timothy P. Brown of footballarchaeology.com.
People say all the time, football evolved from rugby. And yes, that's true, but I just want to emphasize football was rugby. So the early days of what we now think of as gridiron North American football, US and Canada, it was rugby. And when they started the game, they made some minor tweaks, but it was rugby. So the game remained very much rugby-esque until, say, 1890. And they made some rule changes that, including allowing tackling below the waist and things like that, that made it harder to do the outside wide open running of rugby. And so the game started steering towards this, what ultimately became mass and momentum football. So mass meaning, it was basically like playing goal line football, a goal line offense against goal line defense, all 110 yards of the field at the time. And so, the mass refers to the idea of multiple blockers leading the runner through the hole and or grabbing him by the handles that he had sewn on his pants to pull him through the hole. And the momentum referring to, back then they didn't have rules on how many players had to be on the line of scrimmage. So teams they had guards back or tackles back formations and different things. And there was no limit on the number of men who could be moving forward at the snap, similar to what Canada has in their football. And so, they'd have these guys running all at the same time and collapsing into a particular hole and just basically slamming into it to basically overrun one or two players on the defense. And so it was a very dangerous game. And as a result, there were lots of injuries and ultimately deaths, resulting from the nature of the play at the time.
So yes, a rough game indeed. And by design, we sort of skipped over one that many people say was the first football game, 1869, the Princeton and Rutgers game, which I think most experts can tell you they had like 25 people per side. You weren't allowed to carry the ball, and you had to score goals to win. It was an association game, a soccer game. So many experts, including myself, don't consider that the first American football game. It was a brand of football played in America between two colleges, an intercollegiate game, maybe the first of its kind of football here in the States, but not American football as we know it. And we have an expert that we got to talk to a few years ago whose grandfather, was part of developing the game of American football. How exciting is that? Here's Upton Bell.
Well, actually, the most famous group of their time was called the Walter Camp Rules Committee. And ironically, Walter Camp was the man that actually controlled college football, which was a totally different game then. My grandfather, John C. Bell Sr., was a part of the Walter Camp Rules Committee and was second in seniority. Now, they were the forerunner of the modern NCAA. And when players died in the early 1900s, Teddy Roosevelt, the president, had said that basically he was going to ban college football. And so what Camp did, along with my grandfather on my father's side, John C. Bell, they negotiated with Tedy to change certain rules in football so it wouldn't be such a brutal game, which it was then. If you think it's bad today, or if you think it was bad way before that, even though they had leather helmets, the game was very close together. So there were no receivers, there's no real passing game. You just beat the hell out of the person, and anything went. So basically, my grandfather, John C. Bell, negotiated with Walter Camp, with Teddy Roosevelt, to change the rules of the game, and then he was the founder. And it's one other book that people should read because it's written by a Philadelphia Associated Press writer, Bob Lyons. It's called Bert Bell's famous term on any given Sunday. In that book, he details how Walter Camp, but with the help of John Cromwell Bell, was able to change the rules, and that actually my grandfather founded what is today the modern NCAA.
So you can see there was this transformation of rugby football. Comes to the States, the Harvard-McGill game. We adopt some Canadian aspects of the game. Walter Camp is influenced by that. Puts in the scrimmage downs system, a snap of the ball. So scrimmage instead of scrummage that's in rugby. It starts to set itself apart. And it's a brutal game in the early days. People were getting hurt. People were getting killed, as Tim Brown told us. But where would it go from here? Well, that meeting with President Roosevelt between Walter Camp and John C. Bell and others that met in the Oval Office back then in 1905 had some dramatic effects. And then the next time in this series, we're going to talk about some of those with some more expert wisdom and guidance in the history of American football. Hope you've enjoyed this. Till next time, everybody, have a great gridiron day. That's all the football history we have today, folks. Join us back tomorrow for more of your football history. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.